Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good to see you, because I know that tonight you had a lot of choices, so we're really honored that you came to this program tonight. So we have a wonderful program, but before we get started, I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley and the League of Women Voters of Teaneck for co-sponsoring this program. It's a pleasure to have them join us. Our program tonight is really a third topic in a series of topics that we've been conducting, discussing some of the challenges to democracy. So I think you're going to enjoy this program as well. How many of you attended our program last month on gerrymandering? Yeah, okay, well, I think you're going to enjoy this one as well, and we're going to learn a lot. So I don't want to take up too much time. Again, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for your donations. You keep us going. And I want to thank the leagues. So we're ready to start with Peggy, and she'll introduce the speakers.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peggy LaScala. I'm the Issues Coordinator here. Tonight, I'd like to introduce our panel. Our moderator is Lisa Miller. She's a professor of political science at Rutgers University, and Professor Miller's research interests are in law and constitutions, criminal justice, social policy, and racial inequality. Her most recent book, published in 2016, is The Myth of Mob Rule, Violent Crime, and Democratic Politics. Our first presenter tonight will be David Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly is the president and CEO of Every Voice. He's a 20-year veteran of money in politics, organizing, and advocacy, and he has pioneered electoral and issue accountability campaigns. That's a mouthful. He is a regularly sought strategist for organizations, foundations, and elected officials seeking reform. Then Ms. Lisa Gilbert will speak. She is the Vice President of Legislative Affairs at Public Citizen. She advocates for government transparency and integrity, financial reform, civil justice, and consumer protection. Previously, Ms. Gilbert ran the Congress Watch Division at Public Citizen and was the democracy advocate for the U.S. Public Interest Research Group. Then finally, we'll have Mr. William Schluter. He has a 40-year political career in New Jersey, focusing his career on combating political corruption. He authored pioneering laws regulating campaign finance and lobbying, and more recently, Mr. Schluter served as vice chair of the State Ethics Commission. He'll be speaking tonight about his most recent book, Soft Corruption. Here it is. Soft Corruption, How Ethical Misconduct Undermines Good Government and What to Do About It. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you all for being here this evening. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening on this terrific panel with such an extraordinary group of people who've been doing this work for so long. So we won't hesitate. We're just going to begin right away. So David Donnelly, if you'd like to begin. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. It's also a pleasure to be on this panel. I found out earlier today that Lisa is a colleague of my wife's at Rutgers, so it's great to share the panel with you. I've worked with Lisa Gilbert for at least 10 or 12 years, and it's too rare that we actually get to share a panel speaking to people. And I know Senator Schluter from his work trying to implement a program of public financing, a pilot program of public financing here in New Jersey. And so when I think about the word, the title, The Honorable, when they put it in front of elected officials' names, I always think about Senator Schluter. It fits him well. So it's a pleasure to be on this panel. My organization works on the issue of public financing, trying to advance small donor public financing around the country, building the political campaigns and the policy campaigns to adopt far-reaching reform that lifts the voices of regular people in our political process and provides opportunities for new kinds of candidates to run for office. We also work at the federal level. For the sake of tonight's conversation, I'll probably confine most of my conversations about the activity that we see around the country because Lisa has the exciting task of talking about what's happening in Washington. There actually is a fair amount of progress around the country. There are citizens in organizations around the country that are taking matters into their own hands, trying to advance innovative policies to address the issue of money in politics in their own backyard. There are success stories in places like Connecticut and in Maine and in New York City and to a lesser degree in Arizona and a variety of other places where they've adopted programs that allow regular people to run for office on the basis of raising large numbers of small donations and qualifying for a set amount or matching funds of public funds that they can then run their campaign on, and therefore not rely on large contributions from the traditional sources of money in politics. But I wanted to point out one particular innovative example because it's happening in real time right now, and that's what the people in the city of Seattle did a couple years ago by adopting a referendum, a new policy that is the first one of its kind tried in the country, called Democracy Vouchers. It's an innovative policy in which every single registered voter in the city of Seattle gets mailed 4 $25 vouchers that they can give to candidates who choose to only run on small donations. So if you think about that for a minute, you think about how a candidate who chooses to only run for city office with the use of these small donations, all of a sudden every single voter they meet on the street is worth the very same amount to them. They don't have to sit in a room thinking about who are all the lawyers that I know or who are all the people that I have money or raised money in the past. They can think about the neighbor down the street who throws a big barbecue party every year and has a great list of their neighbors that they can invite and come over and try to collect those $25 vouchers from individuals who may not be that politically engaged. The idea in Seattle was, can we actually solve the issue of money in politics or make it dramatically better by vastly increasing participation? Not simply saying, let's try to get money out of politics, but let's try to bring people back in. So in this very first election cycle, it's happening right now. The system only covered 3 races because those are the only 3 races on the ballot that was designed to cover this cycle. We've already seen 12,000 people in Seattle give these small contributions through the vouchers that they received in the mail. Now, 12,000 doesn't sound like a lot. In the entire election cycle in 2015, when there were many more candidates on the ballot, many more races on the ballot, only 4,000 individuals actually made contributions of any size to candidates in Seattle. So we've already seen a 3-fold increase in the number of people participating in Seattle through giving these small donations. Now, who are these people? There's a dramatic increase in young people making contributions. There's a 10% increase in women making donations. There's a huge uptick in people of color making donations, and we know all this because we're able to track this in real time with the City of Seattle's website. So what we're seeing is those historically disadvantaged groups or groups that are traditionally not engaged as much in politics are more engaged under the voucher system, this new system, in just this first election cycle than ever before. Now, who's running for office? Maybe that's the other, it actually has 9 candidates that tried to win in a primary, and there's one particular open race. 7 of them use the voucher system, and more candidates have ever run for that position in the past. The candidate who won the primary, who's probably the leading candidate who will likely win the general election next Tuesday, is someone who says that she would not have run if it weren't for this program. It's the first renter who could possibly be elected to city council in Seattle, right? That's an interesting thing. The experiences that she might bring to public office are somewhat different than someone who's been a homeowner, maybe, perhaps. But it's a good, let's try to figure this out, right? So the idea, and again, this is a sample size of 3 races, and this is one election cycle, and it's one city, and it's the first time a policy like this has been tried. But there are lessons that we think that are important to begin to learn from places like that. And these lessons are beginning to get applied in places like Albuquerque. They're thinking about a ballot question next year based on the same model. Portland, Oregon has a city system of matching funds that they're also implementing with the possibility of trying a pilot program down the road. We're designing a program statewide in Oregon because people are really excited about the prospects of taking their politics back. This is green shoots of politics kind of coming up around the country where we see opportunities where people are not waiting for DC to act. That's one piece of good news. So I'm going to be the Pollyanna. There's good news out there, right? Because I don't have to do the DC thing. Second piece of good news. Following the 2016 elections, I'm not going to be all good news tonight. Following the 2016 elections, we have seen an incredible outpouring of interest in running for office. The organizations that work to help candidates and recruit them to run for office are called pipeline organizations. they've seen an incredible uptick in the number of people running and wanting to get trained. There's one organization that was literally just set up in January called Run for Something, geared at recruiting young people to run for office. 12,000 young people have signed up through their website already to get trainings and decide to run for office. Now, I have a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old, so I know that's not all good, that all these young people are going to run for office. But I'd much rather have more people running than fewer, and I'd much rather have new opportunities for a new generation of people to run because I think our political system is just a little bit stale these days. Now, why is that important for a group that works on money and politics? That means there's so many more people out there raising money and whatever. I actually think it's an incredible opportunity for people who have never been in the game to understand what tools they need to go into public office and change it. Right? These are people who are going to be confronted with all the problems that we see in our democracy for the very first time. They're people who have, maybe they've had several jobs, maybe they have a master's degree or a law degree, or maybe they've decided they work for a nonprofit and they say, all right, now's my time. I want to kind of give back a little bit. I'm in a time before I have kids, or I'm ready to think about, being in public service. And the first thing they're going to be confronted with are people saying, you have to spend all your time raising money. The second thing they're going to be confronted with is they're going to say, well, no, you can't actually think about reaching out to the students on that college campus because only half of it is in your district because the line is drawn down through the middle of it. And the people who go to school there are actually not allowed to vote there because they have to vote where they live back home. Right? So all these rules around gerrymandering and voting rights, I'm glad that you had sessions on other rules, and money in politics, they're all connected and they're all barriers for new people to be able to run for office. But if those new people see how crazy this is, who are thinking they're going to run, and we tool them with those policies and the expertise to go into office and say, part of our mission is to lower the ladder of opportunity for other people like me before they get so inured in office and before they get so bought into the system that got them elected. If we can get them to have the mission to change it, we will raise the floor on what's possible in terms of changing the laws when it comes to money and politics and a variety of other democracy issues. So we're going to be we've already launched a campaign called Every Voice Leads, trying to elect 2,020 people around the country by 2020 who will go into office knowing that their mission is to change campaign finance laws. It's attracted the attention of other groups that work on other democracy issues, and we'll probably repurpose it to launch a national effort to span a variety of different democracy issues over the next couple of months. If we don't raise the issues of democracy and trying to fix it, then when people go in, they'll get so used to the rules as they exist, what they mastered, and they'll want to protect them. So that's the other good piece of news, because there's a lot of people who are emerging to decide to serve in public office, and they're open and they're thirsty for solutions on these particular questions. The bad news front is that this is all done in a context in which the rules are really, really rigged. I don't think I probably need to describe all of it to folks here, but they've been rigged throughout our entire history. I mean, the reality is the story of American democracy is about some people participating and some people not. When you think about all the different ways that we've had to expand the franchise and expand the way that people can have access to the polls or have their voices heard, or some people can vote and some people can't. We've always had a struggle in this country about whether we're going to have a more perfect democracy or whether a democracy is going to work for those who are in power. That we're living through a period right now, though, that there have been constant attacks on the ability of people to participate freely in our democracy. From voting ID laws to redistricting to Supreme Court cases that say some people are more equal than the rest of us when it comes to financing campaigns. So we have our work cut out for us. Those efforts have been a concerted effort by some to kind of stem the tides of values, the changing of values and the changing of our demographics in this country, so that our country, actually our government, doesn't reflect the vast majority of us. It reflects a very narrow slice. And so while we are thinking about these amazing kind of local experiments and sometimes statewide experiments on trying to show a different way of financing elections, and while we're thinking about the opportunity that a new generation of leaders could provide us for ways to lead us to a better kind of democracy, I think we also need to recognize that these fights are probably intensely political. I know this is a educational environment. It's not partisan. And while I may be a registered Democrat, I'm a little d Democrat first. But these are intensely political fights where the powers that be and the different parties are going to try to struggle with one another about who will win. And we're coming up to an election cycle in 2020 that will also hold in the balance all the redistricting stuff that you've talked about in the past, or many of you were here to talk about in the past. So there's going to be a tremendous flow of money into politics because that's the decisions that get made in the next few election cycles are going to be really determinant for the next generation of leaders. And so what I'm really keenly focused on, and what my organization is very focused on, is making sure that when people get elected, they know how to undo and unrig the rules that we've seen rigged so much. So let me stop there and turn it to Lisa.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks so much, David. And just add my thanks for the invitation to be here today and to be on a panel with such wonderful colleagues. I'm Lisa Gilbert, Vice President of Legislative Affairs at Public Citizen. And as was mentioned at the top, Public Citizen's mission is to protect regular Americans from abuses of corporate power. We work on a bunch of different issues ranging from the environment to consumer protection to civil justice. But the underlying impetus for us has always been to try to fix the problems of corruption, money in politics, and imbalances in our elections. If we win on that, we think we can win on everything else. We definitely are in an interesting time to strategize for reform on these topics. So I thought I'd share a little bit about how we see the federal landscape, surprisingly not 100% depressing despite David's preface, and a little bit about opportunities for solutions as well. So on the landscape, it is unquestioned that we have seen a major shift in public understanding of the problem of too much money in politics, of the system being rigged. When you poll, it's across the board that people get that this is an issue. But simultaneously, we have seen the most conflicted and corporate-connected candidate in our history become the President of the United States. Trump actually campaigned with an understanding of the rigged system and that people get it, saying over and over again that there was too much money in politics, that the system was broken, saying that he knew that because he's a billionaire and he had had unprecedented access to politicians because of that. However, as president, it is all too obvious, I don't have to tell people in this room, that he is walking back his commitments to drain the swamp. If anything, he's far worse than the problem, turning his policymaking over to those same corporate-connected special interests and their ethically conflicted representatives, and still worse, taking it a step further and trying to personally profit off of the presidency. So to highlight that point, Public Citizen has done a bunch of research. We found that just before Charlottesville, Trump had met with more than 300 CEOs. That is triple the number that President Obama met with in his entire presidency. We identified more than 100 lobbyists that are working in the administration. More than 36 are working on the exact same issues that they lobbied on before they came into the administration, which is in direct conflict with Trump's much vaunted ethics executive order. And then we did an analysis of the second and third tier appointees to the administration, and we found that 70% of them have corporate ties. And this isn't even getting into the cabinet, which, as folks know, deep industry ties to Wall Street, to ExxonMobil, to the oil and gas companies. In addition to his personnel choices, as I mentioned, Trump has made the very scary choice not to divest his personal company. So he has the ability to make policy decisions that will enrich himself, improving his own profits and bottom line. Activists have continuously highlighted this ever since the president came into office, and certainly highlighted the fact that it's tied to the decisions he's making on policy, whether it's the healthcare fight, the tax fight that we've entered into so robustly today, or what he wants to do with financial protections. So the results of these choices, personnel and policy, have been really distressing. But in the good news, in some ways, because he's so blatant, because his motivations are so obvious, it gives us more avenues to actually push for reform and make change of the system itself. So I wanted to flag a couple of those opportunities as I see them at the federal level, both messaging opportunities and then some opportunities for policy wins, and then something that we see that we can make change within corporations, which is a sort of innovative forum to work within. So at the federal level, we have seen a number of members of Congress pushing for legislation that would rein in conflicts of interest as a direct reaction to what President Trump has been doing and what he stands for. So a couple examples, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts is pushing the Presidential Conflicts of Interest Act, which would force presidents to divest their own personal holdings. Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon has an interesting bill which says that before the president can negotiate trade deals, we would have to learn about where his foreign money lies and whether he has holdings in those countries. Rep. Cicilline of Rhode Island has filed legislation that would say before the president can roll back any given regulation on financial reform or the environment or consumer protection or whatever, he would have to do a benefits analysis. So we would need to know exactly how the president and his cabinet and others at the highest level of government are benefiting. So obviously, these are all message bills. We don't believe that they can pass in our current political environment, but they are key, important messages to put out there and make sure that we are all supporting and trumpeting. However, there is one area that we do think that we can make real change and we can pass a bill, and this is tied into what is the scandal of the year, the Russia investigation. So thanks to the revelations that are surrounding the Russia election interference and the fact that they use social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Google to influence the election in favor of Trump, we have a real outcry for reform and for disclosure of what and who are putting advertisements on these types of platforms. So because of that, the Federal Election Commission is poised to begin rulemaking on the issue, and Senators Klobuchar, Warner, and McCain, so bipartisan legislation, is moving to make sure that citizens know who they're being advertised to when they go on Google, when they go on Facebook. It's a fast-moving area. Tech companies are scrambling to comply and figure out what to do. So we think there's real momentum and a chance to pass that bill, and it's called the Honest Ads Act. So beyond federal legislation, which I would admit is not a really ripe area beyond what I just mentioned, one of the things that we see as a place for reform is working within corporations themselves. Maybe surprising based on all the corporate connectivity that I just talked about, but not every corporation is tied to Trump. And at Public Citizen, we have been working to convince and share with the big corporations the fact that if they do what they can to distance themselves from this administration, then they will be able to be above the fray, the political scrum that so many corporations find themselves engaged in. We've been working for years to get the big corporations to voluntarily disclose their own political spending and their lobbying. We partner with shareholders, with investors who are filing resolutions at companies calling for that political spending disclosure. We work with them and do organizing outside the meetings, get media attention, and apply pressure to companies. So again, President Trump's strong corporate ties have lent additional momentum to this campaign. Companies feel like they're in the hot seat, whether they're aligned with the administration decisions or not. One good example is when the athletic apparel company Under Armour CEO Kevin Plank said in a CNBC interview he thought the president was a real asset to the country. There was huge public backlash. Folks may remember Misty Copeland and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson coming out and distancing themselves. They were brand ambassadors for Under Armour, and they said they wouldn't be anymore. This celebrity criticism had such a big impact that Susquehanna Financial downgraded Under Armour's stock to negative, citing reputational risk. So just one example. Similarly, following the tragedy in Charlottesville, a lot of companies faced blowback for their association with Trump's business councils. It led to boycotts and protests and eventually the disbanding of those business councils. A lot of CEOs realized it didn't look good to be associated with this moment where someone was seemingly supporting neo-Nazis and they ran for the exits. So obviously, there are risks of being involved with this administration or even just being seen as being associated, even if the CEOs aren't doing anything with the company or with the president at that moment. So we really hope that companies take a larger lesson from this. Americans are really paying close attention to what companies are doing nowadays and how they align themselves politically. So we want to make sure that they use this opportunity and move towards disclosure, that they understand that if they are more transparent, they will get credit for that. And many companies are actually making that move. So at Public Citizen, we're going to continue to do the work that it takes to apply pressure to these companies, but we have seen increased momentum and more companies choosing to voluntarily disclose their political spending and their lobbying. So to finish up, I'll just say that while the corporate cronyism of Trump is something that is scary and hard to watch, it is giving us real opportunities. We think the opportunities on the federal level are both for strong messages in support of pushing back on corruption, pushing back on too much money in politics, and advocating for transparency. We think there is a chance to pass the Honest Ads Act. And then there's this interesting opportunity to apply pressure to corporations to show them that they have the ability to push back on this quest for allegiance that Donald Trump is seeking and to move towards more disclosure and transparency. And thanks.
Okay. Bill.
Can I speak up on this?
You sure may, yeah, of course.
I'm more used to standing up when I speak, and then I don't have to watch Lisa over here with her prompt card saying your time is up. But believe me, I won't take too much of your time. A prominent Trenton journalist once said, in New Jersey, politics is all about money. How true. And I'm going to speak about New Jersey tonight. I do not have a knowledge of the national situation as much as Lisa and maybe David do, but I will try and zero in on New Jersey and our local election system, which is very dear to everybody's heart here. I've written a book called Soft Corruption. I have a few copies out there if people are interested in securing them. This talks about the outrages of misdemeanors by government officials, not illegal misdemeanors, but ethical misdemeanors. And there are plenty of them in New Jersey. Now, it talks about 5 functions where soft corruption occurs: campaign finance, lobbying, conflict of interest, patronage, and the electoral process. Now, people who are in government can engage in these activities without being corrupt, and a lot of people do. But unfortunately, in the state of New Jersey, there's too many people that feel that it's to their benefit, money-wise and power-wise, to operate in that particular area. Now, under New Jersey's wide-open contribution limits, a donor can give up to $37,000 to a county political party. That's a lot of money. They can only give $2,100 to a candidate. This was back in the year 2001, 2002. But people get around it. Jared Kushner's father, Charles Kushner, who ran that real estate empire, decided that he wanted to fund Jim McGreevy's gubernatorial campaign. So on one day in 2001, he had 41 of his associates give the maximum amount, $2,100 each, from the same location on the same day with the same business affiliation, making $85,000 to the McGreevy campaign fund. This was a way to get a big chunk of money in and not be limited by the $2,100 contribution limit. There are other outrages or examples of how money operates in politics. In the year 2003, 2 high-powered Middlesex County political and real estate operatives each gave a check in the amount of $27,000 to the Hunterdon County Democratic Organization. Now, anybody that knows politics in that neck of the woods knows that that amount of money is not going to elect Democrats in Hunterdon County. Hunterdon County is too Republican. A couple of months later, Hunterdon County Democrat Organization sent $50,000 to a campaign for mayor in Ocean County. They could take both of those contributions and wheel them over to Ocean County for another campaign. The amount you can wheel is unlimited. And the mayor in Ocean County won, and the people in Middlesex County got their development approved. In 1997, Governor Whitman was promoting an $2.8 billion bond issue, which was not very popular with the people in New Jersey. And it came up to a vote. It was going to be voted on in the Senate. I was in the Senate at the time, in June of 1997. All the Democrats were against it, and there were 6 Republicans who were opposed, and that was 3 votes shy of getting it passed. Well, after the vote was taken, there were still 3 votes shy. the Senate president left the rostrum. He went down into the chambers, and he got to 3 desks of 3 people, Senators Bubba, LaRosa, and Scott, to persuade them to try and convince them to change their votes. And each one of them finally caved. And the bill passed, and the bond issue became law. Well, later that year, those 3 senators were up for re-election, and they got $480,000 from the Senate president's PAC. The leadership PACs can raise a tremendous amount of money. They got $480,000. That was 42% of all the money that they raised. But they lost. Well, as luck would have it, in 1998, when they were no longer in office, they ended up with state jobs at $85,000 apiece. So this is how patronage and money work in hand, and people come out on top. The examples of campaign finance abuse by lobbyists are pretty well known and pretty common. Lobbyists can give in New Jersey, and on one occasion in 1989, the 4 Democrats in the Assembly, and I'm not picking on Democrats, believe me, I happen to be a Republican. I have as many of these things in the book about Republicans as I do Democrats. But 4 Democrats in the Assembly invited the lobbyists on State Street to come across from the State House to join them in a private office to talk about politics in general. Jim Florio was destined to win that election, and the report came out that this was just a feel-good kind of gathering. But in January, one of the lobbyists had a stroke of conscience, and she decided she would go public and say this was not an informative session, this was a shakedown. We were told that one of these 4 is going to be the speaker, and we want $20,000 from each lobby. And they got over $167,000 from that particular operation. And this is how blatant it is. Does money buy results in New Jersey and in politics? It certainly does, as we all can understand. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the early 1990s, optometrists mailed a circular to members urging campaign contributions to support passage of special legislation favoring their profession, saying, if you want it, you have to pay for it. It's that simple. Senator Cardinale told a medical society convention in 2003 that if all doctors contributed $500, quote, legislators would trip over themselves to support your cause. And in a federal corruption trial in Newark involving Mazzocchi Wrecking Company, which had contracts for city demolition work, the CEO of Mazzocchi, Nicholas Mazzocchi, said, quote, I make political contributions because I learned over the years that not making them, I lost tens of millions of dollars. This is the kind of situation we have here in New Jersey, and it's not getting any better. As far as lobbyists, they do carry a lot of weight. They do provide a lot of money for campaigns. Early in his term as governor, Jim McGreevey, his administration let it be known to lobbyists that if their clients wanted FaceTime with the governor, it would cost $25,000 in payment to the Democratic State Committee. And a number of the clients did that. So this was more of a direct kind of contribution. We all know that when there is a contribution made, that if there is a contract signed or a verbal commitment that's on tape or something like that, it's illegal. There is a quid pro quo, and we have pay-to-pay laws to prevent excessive amounts of money being given to contractors who do business with the government. Incidentally, the pay-to-pay laws have a big loophole. The same special interests can give to PACs, who then give directly to the candidates. And so the amount of money going to the candidates has not changed much. It's just going through different channels. I have prepared a list of recommendations for reform, which you can pick up out there. And I'll read some of these off here. And you can take those home with you and see if you agree with them or not. And they do include a lot of other areas beside campaign finance. I was told that we should concentrate our discussion tonight on money and politics, so that's what I will do. But the recommendations are as follows. First of all, the Supreme Court Citizens United decision has got to be addressed by the representatives in Congress. This can be done by, first of all, in New Jersey, we can require disclosure of contributions and expenditures by these special interest super PACs. There is an effort in Congress to change the Constitution, to change this free speech amendment, which might sound like heresy to many people, but it has passed the House, and it could even take place where they finally they refine the definition of campaign contributions and how it can corrupt and what legislatures can do to eliminate that. The most basic step that can be taken, as you've heard before, is have public financing of elections. Public financing we have for the gubernatorial election, it has been somewhat helpful, but it can be extended to legislative, to freeholder, to mayors of large cities, and things like that. And this is a good way to get the bad money out of politics. We should reduce the amount of contribution limits that now exist, because, my goodness, it's now up to $2,600 from an individual, and $2,600 to a member of council or a school board member is an exorbitant amount. But we should also reduce the amount that can be given to parties from $25,000 to $10,000, and we should eliminate the wheeling, where these political treasuries get many contributions of $37,000 or $25,000, and then they combine it all and they send it off to the candidate who is chosen, who is their choice to win an election. With respect to lobbying, some states, Connecticut, requires a limit on the amount of money that lobbyists can give to campaigns, and I think New Jersey would do well to enact that. We should pass laws about dual office holding. Dual office holding is an extensive practice here in New Jersey, where people in government, lawmakers, who don't make an awful lot of money in their government jobs, want to have a second job, and this is natural. But sometimes when they have the second job, there are conflicts, and these conflicts can be eliminated. As a matter of fact, a number of people favor full-time legislative services for legislators. This has been advocated in California, and they adopted it, full-time with adequate compensation, so that you avoid these kind of conflicts. One of the biggest reforms that my book talks about, and which is so important to what everybody here is trying to do, particularly in New Jersey, is to reform the electoral process. Because if you don't get good people in New Jersey, all the good recommendations that are talked about here and elsewhere by your group and other groups are going to go nowhere, as they have up to date. They go nowhere because the establishment wants the status quo. So you've got to open up the electoral process so that the bosses don't control who gets on the ballot. And who gets on the ballot on the party line with a party slogan is absolutely crucial to who gets elected. And I know that Lisa, your comment about getting, and Dave, your comment about getting more people involved, this is great. But if they don't get on the ballot in a good spot on the party line or with a good ballot position, they're not going to go anywhere. So reforms have to be made also with respect to the election. And these are the basic recommendations that I have made. And then you ask, okay, Bill, these are all very good, but how are you going to get all these good recommendations passed? How are you going to have them adopted? I think we have to change the way it's done. And we change the way it's done by advocating a new strategy, which is limited INR, limited initiative and referendum. Initiative and referendum limited just to those 5 areas that I told you about where there's soft corruption: campaign finance, lobbying, conflict of interest, patronage, and the electoral process. And have a judicial review of any petition to be sure that it meets that standard. And then have other safeguards whereby the petitioners, if the legislature makes an adequate change or makes a change in accordance with a petition, then and the petitioners agree that that's a satisfactory change, it can be accepted and it doesn't go to referendum. But the process of a limited INR program in New Jersey where the people come out and advocate for reform. Organizations such as the Network for Responsible Public Policy, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Citizens United, and all these other organizations can bond together and come up with programs which make sense and then would be put on the ballot. Now, this is a major step for New Jersey or any place to adopt such a program, because it would take it out of the hands of the legislature. But the legislature and state government has been unable to adopt these reforms for so many years. A lot of these reforms that you hear about are in bill form, advocated and endorsed and sponsored by important people, but they go nowhere. Why? Because the establishment doesn't want to change. So we have to have something to shake up the establishment, and that's why I think that this limited INR, which, as I say, has been endorsed by the Brennan Center of New York, is a good way to go, and it would be a wonderful opportunity for organizations such as yours to go out and really make a name for yourself and embark on a program of reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our. Well, thank you very much. That's a lot of information and food for thought and discussion. So let me just, I want to start just with a couple of very quick clarifying questions, because I think this is useful information for all of us who don't spend our time thinking about these issues. So Lisa, I just wanted to clarify if you could just tell us briefly what the current disclosure laws are. You said you work with corporations on disclosure. What are the federal disclosure laws in terms of who has to say how much they've given where?
Sure. So in speaking of corporations, folks, Citizens United was just referenced. What that allowed is corporations giving unlimited amounts. If they give through conduit organizations, that is not disclosed at all. So the money we're trying to get at is that. Sort of if you are ExxonMobil and you give to a trade association which gives to a nonprofit, then you see an ad on your television that's run by Citizens for Good Stuff and Puppies, and you don't know who that is. You don't know that you can't trace it back to ExxonMobil. So there's very little disclosure on the big secret money that we're most concerned about. There is disclosure if you give to a PAC as an entity, but that's much more limited nowadays since there's so much allowed.
But there's nothing in Citizens United that would keep Congress from requiring disclosure to those other.
No,
Right.
And they tried to do it with the Disclose Act many times, so we hope to see it someday.
Good. And David, again, quick clarifying question for you, because again, I think this is useful thinking about federal laws versus state laws. Mm-hmm. So some of the things you're talking about are all possible under state law, right? States have a lot of control over their voting, so you can't campaign in our state if you don't disclose your taxes, for example. Or how far can they go with that? And this is a question, I guess, for Bill as well. Could New Jersey pass a law saying, you have to disclose your taxes if you want to campaign for president in New Jersey? How much can states do things that affect not just state and local elections, but also federal elections?
States have actually a fair amount of latitude. Actually, have more latitude because of some bad Supreme Court decisions, like their gutting of the Voting Rights Act. But states have a lot more latitude to pass laws that impact federal elections than they had before. The one exception, however, is campaign finance law. In 1974, the Congress passed a law called the Federal Election Campaign Act that created the presidential public financing program, as well as the set of contribution limits and other things that have been, kind of the basic framework for campaign finance law for the past 40 years. And in that law, they basically prohibited states from passing their own campaign finance laws that impact federal elected officials. What they wanted to avoid is having someone running in Massachusetts with a different set of contribution limits than someone who's running in New Hampshire. But, and basically, like ballot access, who gets on the ballot, whether the party name is associated with the person on the ballot, how the names actually get there. All that stuff is determined by local and state elected officials.
Thank you. And Bill, just to clarify, I like your referendum initiative idea. I think that's also something that's people can get rallied around because it can be very locally mobilizing. But I don't know if people realize this, but New Jersey is sort of famous for having one of the most powerful governorships in the country. Is there anything that can be done at the level of assuming the governor would want it done, which is perhaps a big assumption? Is there anything that can be done at the executive level to disrupt some of these patterns?
Well, you can't, I don't think, convince the present governor to adopt this program that we have in soft corruption or these programs. But I think that there has to be a groundswell. And if you get a governor who's got fire in his or her belly, and a bunch of organizations such as yours here that get behind it, legislators who decide that we're going to support these reforms or we're not going to get elected, and then get the press behind it. And the press, unfortunately, has been decimated by layoffs and things recently. What happened in 230 years ago? A lot of people didn't think we would come out with what we did, and we did, and it was quite radical. So I have hopes that it can be done. I hope things don't get worse before they get better, but we have to keep trying.
I like your optimism. Call to mobilizing. Okay, so let me start with a general question to all of you that I just so we sort of get everything on the table. Some people, we're sort of assuming that we all think that there's something that has to be done to rein in money, but some people don't agree. Some people say if you constrain campaign spending, you're going to disadvantage disadvantage challengers, because incumbents have name recognition, incumbents need money to overcome all those things, and so the sort of careful what you wish for, right? That by reining in that money, you're going to have some problems for people who are trying to challenge the very people who might be clinging to these kinds of laws. Others might say, well, look, if a certain group of people are particularly mobilized or have a particular issue that concerns them and they raise a lot of money, why shouldn't they be able to give? Other people can mobilize people too if they so choose. So I wonder if you encounter those arguments in some of the work you do, and if so, how you respond. And I guess we'll just start here and go down.
Yeah, I think those are reasonable arguments, and from public citizens' perspective, we don't often talk about the amount of money as the problem. It's more the source of the money. So if we had a system of public financing the way David describes, it would be coming from all of us, and so it would be less problematic than right now, where corporate interests and other special interests, millionaires and billionaires, have outsized access and influence to politicians because of what they can give. We do think there needs to be reasonable limits. We can't have campaigns that run away with themselves, but reining in money is often less important to us than transparency and public financing.
Yeah, I agree largely with that. It's actually, for years, a lot of campaign finance reform policy was focused on prohibition, right? To try to stop certain kinds of activities, or try to rein in spending, or try to encourage only certain kinds of contributions. And I actually think that kind of led us into a set of court decisions that were problematic. And so I think a better way to kind of think about our campaign finance system is more through the lens of participation rather than prohibition, right? More from encouraging lots more people to engage, within a framework that encourages their engagement. I'm not going to give a small contribution if I know that someone else is going to give $1 million to the same candidate. Why would I bother, right? Why would I waste my $5 contribution? But if I know that everyone else is giving around the same amount and there's thousands of people who are giving to that candidate, then I feel like I'm part of something. It's one of the powers of the Bernie Sanders campaign, is people saw the ability to collect those contributions together. And so we think that the incentives for more participation is so important. It outweighs like whether we should have spending limits or caps. Now, it may be that some point in the future we'll have to revisit these types of questions, but in this current environment in which the Supreme Court says you can't limit spending, and you can't limit outside spending, groups like from the Citizens United perspective as pouring in a lot of money in these what are called independent expenditures, supposedly not connected to the campaigns. In that kind of environment, why would we want people who are collecting lots of people around them to agree to have to limit their own spending, right? So we want actually a robust democracy with more people participating. The answer to some of the problems of our democracy is more democracy, not less.
And do you agree, Bill, that the issue is less the amount of money than sources of money, or would you like to see some real hard caps on spending?
Well, I advocated a number of reductions in these spending limits, particularly this wheeling business where in New Jersey, the power bosses in one county might be able to collect a lot of money from very big donors, and they collect it for a reason. They're going to wheel that up to another county that needs the money and where there's a crucial election at the time. Mm-hmm. We saw in Bergen County when they ran the county executive race in, I think, 2002, the Republicans had a good candidate in Hank McNamara. And any of you from Bergen County? Woo! We are in Bergen County. Yeah. But there were $3 million dumped into the Democratic candidate's campaign in the last month, and that defeated McNamara. Now, the $3 million came from three sources. Came from Corzine, came from John Lynch in Middlesex County, and it came from Dave Norcross. And they had their ability to get Camden County Democrats and Middlesex County and all these other counties to transfer those big funds that were wheeled up to, and that is those contributions can be limited by law.
Contributions
can, and I think they should be. About the only thing you can do with some of these big contributions, the independent expenditures, is hope for accountability and transparency by having the givers report them and let the people decide and try and get your reforms through other means.
Thank you. I'm interested in this idea that each of you touched on in one way or another, sort of the link between campaign finance and participation, increasing participation. And it does seem like that's not something we often think about when we think about campaign finance. We think about limiting spending or finding out who's giving it. And I think that's a really interesting and important linkage that you're all making. And I wondered if we could pursue that a little bit, how each of us can think about doing that in our own communities. It strikes me, Bill, when you were talking, and I'm from Philadelphia, but I live in Philadelphia again now, but we lived here for 12, 13 years. And I've always thought that New Jersey was such an interesting place because it's, 2-to-1 registered Democrats to Republicans, and the Democrats have a pretty strong lock on the legislature. And it seems like one of the problems is that there's this sort of small cadre of people that are doing all the politicking, and regular folks don't have much influence on that. And it seems like if there were greater competition, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but within the Democratic Party, right? Greater competition for some of those seats, we'd see more challenges to some of the corruption and some of the patronage and self-dealing. So I wondered if each of you or whoever would like to has a couple of thoughts that we could maybe take away on how we can encourage more people to become involved, more people to make donations. And as a professor, I'm especially interested because I encourage my students to do these things. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the solutions we've touched on, which is we do need systems of public financing, which make it easier for people to run because it doesn't feel insurmountable. It feels like you can raise the money too, and so it makes sense if you have a hankering to engage in civics to run. Right now, it feels like there are too many barriers to that. Often when people even start thinking about it, they don't know how, and then they understand once they do that they don't have enough money to actually do it. But beyond that, I think we're in a very interesting moment for activism and engagement. The upsurge of indivisible chapters and the excitement post-election when people feel so outraged. I think we're in a moment where there will be more engagement, and so it's more critical than ever that we think about changing those systems because, as David was saying, there are all these new young people who want to be part of the process. Maybe they want to run, and we should do everything we can to encourage that.
Yeah, it also helps to be able to see yourself in public office or see not someone who's like you. So here's an interesting mini campaign that we're trying out at Every Voice. It's based on this TV show called The Mayor. The Mayor is on ABC. It's on Tuesday nights. 9:30. They don't pay me. And we're running a campaign. In the show, that the premise of the show is a 27-year-old black man runs for mayor in his hometown because he wants to promote his rap career. And he just wants to but he actually catches the attention of people in his hometown. And he just begins to point out the problems, and he beats the incumbent. And the show is about him governing, right? And so here is an opportunity for other young black men to see someone like themselves in office actually governing, struggling with the challenges that small cities have. And so we're running a campaign every Tuesday night from 9:30 to 10, and then however long the campaign goes on, about talking about the themes that the show comes up and why a candidate who isn't beholden to the system, isn't beholden to the old boy network, is making different decisions, is facing different challenges. And so if we can see ourselves, if people can see themselves in public office or see themselves as part of the debate, so that's why we can't win this just with outrage against what's happening in Washington. We have to win it with some version of a vision of what we want our democracy to be. So that version of how we envision it, that's why stories like, who the hell in Bergen County cares about what happens in Seattle, right? It's like, you guys don't care what happens in Seattle. It's like, it's like on the left coast and it rains there, and it's like, Seahawks are kind of an okay football team, but who really cares what happens in Seattle? The reality is people actually are doing things there that are learning lessons that are going to be able to be applied to lots of other places because they're willing to innovate. They're willing to try new things because their system was just so sclerotic and it was preventing people from being active. Why you're here on a Thursday night listening to, those of us kind of coming out of the weeds for a little while to tell you some stories. It's like that. So those versions of stories and hope, we have to be able to tie them together, and we have to think about new ways of communicating them. Otherwise, all we hear is the 80% of the news coverage that's about awful stuff happening. So,
Well, I think the fact that there are tons of money in politics and the fact that this money buys results is an indisputable fact in the minds of the public, not only in New Jersey, but in this country. And I think that people realize that. And so you have to have transparency and accountability to the maximum extent possible. You talked before about these other levels where money is spent and collected, and you have leadership PACs. Now, leadership PACs, in my opinion, they are run by four people: the majority leader of the Senate and the Senate president and the minority leader, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the minority leader. One from each party in each house. And I fought that, along with Hank McNamara, incidentally, fought that tooth and nail back in 1993. It passed because the politicians wanted the ability to collect the money from the person who controls the legislative agenda. And it's as simple as that. If interests want their bills passed, they've got to get the approval of Sweeney and Prieto, or whoever these two leaders are. Leadership PACs should be done away with, in my opinion, or should be represented by their caucuses, not just one person who builds up a political cult of having all this money and then being able to dole it out. Like I told you, DeFrancesco doled it out to the people who voted the way on that pension bond issue, and that was the leadership PAC. There are other ways to increase, and the fall off in voters is bad. You need more competition. I wasn't here when you spoke about redistricting, but that's an important part. But how many of you have heard of instant runoff voting? Instant runoff voting. A number of you have. Well, that is a rather strategic and quite a radical change, but it would increase the number of people, in my opinion, who would be interested in elections and would come to the polls and vote. Instant runoff voting is where, when you have one office and more than two people running for it, you insist that the winner has to get at least 50%. And if you don't have 50%, then what you have done on the ballot, everybody has voted for a second choice. They vote for who they want, and then they vote the second choice. And if nobody gets 50%, then all of the people on the person who came in third or fourth on that election, all the people who voted their second choice get that second choice passed on to the other candidates. And it's a way to increase participation so that people will not feel that they're a spoiler and then they're not wasting a vote. But you have a lot of these and Oregon is a state that has a lot of stuff where if people feel they're more involved and they get more at stake, they'll participate.
No, that's absolutely true, and those are actually fantastic reforms that if they can be done, will actually do increase not only participation but then competition. But I'm curious, David, if your organization, I mean, Bill's talking about really head on some of these things, right? Are you engaged at that level with legislatures as well, or are you thinking more about the how can we do this from the bottom up?
Yeah, I think there's lots of ways that we're going to have to skin this cat. There are so many different challenges with the way that our democracy works that no one solution is going to address it. As dramatic and as important as the policy work that I think that we do on adopting small donor systems around the country that allow new people to run and new people to be heard in the political system, it dramatically changes all the incentives for candidates. As much as I think that it's an incredibly important component, it's just one policy among several that have to be tried. Most of the state organizations we engage with around the country, including some in Oregon and other places, sequence these types of reforms. They'll work on one reform, this year, they'll pass that, they'll work on the next. They want automatic voter registration, for example, where you don't have to find a DMV to go get registered. You don't have to change your registration when you move from one address to another. It happens automatically by the state, internal system. So like those types of reforms actually make voting much easier. Mailing in ballots. There's a variety of different reforms that work together as a package. But again, all those reforms, and you're going to hear me here say participation way too many times, but all those reforms are based on this idea that our democracy is better when more people can participate, that it's more perfect, it's expanding the franchise. And that means real power for lots more people, which means the people who are currently in power and have it, the people that Bill likes talking about, are the ones that don't want these types of changes, and it will take outside pressure and independent political organizations. Even in states that, you think that there are a lot of Democrats or progressives and they should pass stuff. Like I come up doing Massachusetts politics and talk about a state that should actually have great, democratic, little d democratic laws because of the history of the state, right? You think about the history of Massachusetts. The legislature's 80% Democratic office holders. They don't want to change the way the system works. They get elected. Yeah, and it's like the primary systems are where it's all at. So of course there's power wants to stay in power. They're not going to give that up without independent political organizations pushing them. And these are often scary policies, but they're so important to expand the franchise, expand how democracy works for more people.
Do I have time for one more? I'm sure there's audience questions. If I have one more question for Lisa. Okay. I actually wanted to come back to something you said about technology and foreign money. I think that's a really, really interesting and kind of head-spinning problem, right? Because there's so much at stake, but there's also so much that's hidden. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I know that there were some hearings with the Facebook and Google and all those groups. How on earth can we keep track of this kind of I don't even quite know what to call it, back channel influencing of elections with a lot of money, somebody who can afford to pay 200 people to make up stories and send them, in various ways targeted to different parts of the country. How do we grapple with that?
Yeah, it is a real challenge and it is a real scandal, and that is something that people everywhere in the country are coming to grips with, and certainly it's resonating in DC, which is why I highlighted it as a place where there is a real chance for reform. So the companies themselves, I do think this is a moment where we individual consumers can pressure Facebook and Google and Twitter and all of these platforms that we use to do the right thing, because they feel sheepish and are actively seeking change. And so already Facebook has changed the way they sell their ads. If you go right now to buy an ad, you have to disclaim that you are not a foreign entity, and then they are claiming that they're going to set up a database where you can look and see where the Facebook ads came from, and actually as a consumer figure out and watchdog the political advertising that you're seeing. They're not going to change their algorithms. They're still going to send you the same kinds of things, so it'll be a little bit on all of us to engage and figure out why we're seeing the things that we're we're seeing. So it is an important first step, and Twitter is planning to do something similar, as is Google. They were all the CEOs were up talking this week at 2 distinct hearings. But also we need something that imposes from on high. This is a time where we need uniform disclosure requirements. We always need uniform disclosure requirements, but this is a time when we might get them because there is so much political pressure and there is bipartisan will to do it. So the Honest Ads Act that I mentioned will require similar disclosures to what we see for television broadcasting for all of these sorts of platforms. And then it is possible that the Federal Election Commission will finally do a rulemaking on this as well. But there are tons of ways that regular folks can engage with this right now, commenting to the FEC, talking to your elected officials and asking them to co-sponsor the Honest Ads Act. But I think there is a real shot, so it's certainly worth engaging on it right now while the iron is hot.
If people go to the website for Public Citizen, and can they click through to some of this information, how to go to the FEC and post?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Citizen.org.
Yeah. Okay. I know there's probably quite a few questions, so I don't want to overuse my time. So if you'd like to start that would be great.
Yes, we will. But before we start, I wonder, do you have a final statement or something, paragraph you'd like to leave our audience with so they know how to go forward?
Sure. Well, not a specific final statement prepared, but just sort of reiterating that there are a lot of opportunities, and though it can seem a little bit bleak, there are chances to make your voice heard, to engage in all the different campaigns that we've been talking about, to push companies where you are a shareholder. Everyone here probably has a 401k or a pension. They are investing in companies on your behalf, and those companies should be disclosing their political spending, so make your voice heard in that way, and then support the pieces of legislation that I was mentioning. I think there is real awareness of the corruption that's happening in D.C., and we need to seize it and push for the reforms that we want.
I'll encourage people to educate themselves. So this coming here is a great first step, not because I'm here, but because these 2 other people are here. If you actually are a complete junkie on the issue of money in politics and you want a daily news feed on all the stories around the country, send me an email at david@everyvoice.org. I can get you on our clips list. We have a morning clips that just covers all the waterfront, all the good things, all the bad things that are happening. Thank Cory Booker for his co-sponsorship of a bill called the Fair Elections Now Act, which is a small donor public financing act. It's the first time he's co-sponsored. He's given it lip service in the past. He's gotten on board. So if you have the opportunity to drop his office an email or make a phone call, I would praise his leadership on that issue. And then just more broadly, as you speak to candidates or as you see candidates who are asking for your vote, ask them whether they respect yours, whether they really respect it, and whether they're going to actually make it possible for more people to vote, more people to be heard, more people to run for office. We need to develop an idea of what the concept of a pro-democracy candidate is. We know what a pro-gun or pro-choice or pro-environment candidate is. We don't know what a pro-democracy candidate is. We need to develop that, and it's not going to happen because someone like me in a group in D.C. says it should be. It's going to be because lots and lots of people raise up and ask candidates questions like this.
Yes, I think that what you're doing is what should be done more and more and more. And I would suggest that you go out to candidate meetings where candidates speak to a group, to your local government, your local people, and ask them a number of questions. Ask them if they agree with the idea that these recommendations should be adopted. And then after that, if they say yes, as they usually will say, and you can get a copy of that outside before you leave, then ask them if they agree to the way it might be done by limited INR. And this is the way you have to start a groundswell. Now, there is one candidate for governor who has endorsed this book and the recommendations. That's Gina Genovese. She has endorsed it, but it hasn't come out because she doesn't get much press. And you just have to keep working at it and insist that you have honest, straightforward, trustworthy candidates.
Thank you all very much. I think we learned a lot tonight. Do you agree? We learned a lot tonight? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so before we start our Q&A, just want to let you know that Bill's book is out there. There are other books for sale. You can take a look at them on your way out. We have one more program coming up. It's not going to be in this area. It's going to be in Boonton, and it's going to be a film screening on a film called Fix It, which is going to explain single-payer health care. And that's going to be in Boonton, if you feel like traveling up there, not that far. And then we will resume our programs in January. We take a break over December. So let's go to the Q&A, and how we'll handle it is we have two people with microphones. Raise your hand, and they will bring a microphone to you, and I will be very fair. We'll start on one side, go to the other side, and change in that way. So who's got a question? Question.
Is there room for a third party? And I'm not talking about Teddy Roosevelt, a party that's devised to get one man elected president, but can we have a third party that focuses more on legislation than on becoming a president?
Well, I can give you the answer. New Jersey has the toughest law of any state in the country for the establishment of a third party. You have to get 10% of the vote for all of the assembly in a year when the full assembly is up for election at a general election in order to establish the party. And they don't do it. But this is the other parties, in my opinion, the Democrats and Republicans, they know each other, but they're scared of a third party. They don't know how to judge them. And that's something that a reform group like you could reduce that 10% to 2% or make it like New York, where it's 50,000 votes for the governor, where it makes it easier, and you could do it by initiative and referendum.
There are some states that have much easier ballot access laws for third parties. Presidential elections, and I think you're probably talking federally. Is there room for a third party in national politics? There's a really interesting election, not just here in New Jersey next week, but in Virginia. There's an incredibly contentious, awful debate between Republican and Democratic candidates running for governor. A lot of racist, xenophobic, awful ads that the Republican candidate is trying to tap into what he thinks would be a way to generate support from the Trump voters in Southern Virginia. It's been an awful thing to watch. If he fails, if the Democratic candidate succeeds in that race, it is possible that the Republican Party does some soul searching and there's some fracturing or the scrambling of the party. But I'm not that hopeful that there is a room right now for the third party. I think it would take an extraordinary individual running for president in 2020 to drive that kind of a debate.
No.
Can I elaborate on that?
Well,
I'm
let's give
sorry.
Lisa a chance.
I agree with what David just said. I think that it's a challenging moment to expect something like that to happen, but certainly there's a sense that the 2020 election is going to be very interesting. Already, anyone and everyone who thinks they might want to run is burnishing their credentials and talking about it, and so some of those people are currently independents, so we'll see if they remain so in that election. But if there is a true new third party, I think the challenges for that are very high right now. The bar's high.
Actually, I don't know how many of you know that the present law says that in order for a party to continue to be a party, they've got to get 10% of that vote in the primary. Now, for a number of years, both Republican and Democrat parties got less than 10%. They got 4%, 5% of the vote in the primaries to equal the number of people who would be voting in the assembly races. And the Conservative Party took them to court, and the first judge ruled, yes, we can't give these two parties the party line this year because they didn't get the 10% of the vote. But they got an appeal, and they had a rump session of a court and some other things, and they overturned it. But anyway, so the present parties don't live up to what is standard in the law.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Okay, over here.
Senator Schluter, I think your idea of initiative and referendum is an excellent one. It would certainly change the political landscape. Right now in New Jersey, we do have initiative and referendum on the municipal level in many municipalities, but we don't have it at all on the state level. What would it take to get that ability? Would it take just a state law being passed, or would it take an amendment to the Constitution?
In my judgment, it would take an amendment to the Constitution. And
how would that occur?
Pardon me?
How would you get the amendment?
Well, the amendment would have to go through the legislature, both houses, but not the governor. Now, in the 1970s, the parties used to have conventions each year. They would get a convention. They would adopt a party platform. They don't do that anymore. They just go on power and money, and they don't go on ideas. So we've got to get back to the basics.
Is there a question? Okay, and over here.
I'm a little pessimistic that just making things transparent, letting people know where the money's coming from, is actually going to make a huge difference. Most people, I think, are overwhelmed with finding out what the truth is about a particular candidate. I mean, if you look at the political literature we've gotten on our doors and in the mail and everything, and the pictures capturing the candidate frowning and things like that, I think people are overwhelmed. I'm surprised, actually, that a lot of these nonprofit groups don't get together and put up a website that would be vetting the truth, but bipartisan, like a CBO for the media, so that there would be one place where people could go and have this stuff vetted, and everybody would know about it. Right now, the closest thing I know of is Vote 411, but I'd like to see all the nonprofits supporting one instead of all of you going about your own ways trying to do things. I don't think the transparency is going to make that much of a difference.
What's your question?
So the question is, am I not right? Do you really think? No, do you really think that transparency is going to really do it?
I mean, it's a very fair question, and I am in no way saying that transparency is an end. I think transparency is a means. If we understand more about where the money is coming from, I do think that it enables us, whether the us we're talking about is nonprofits or just citizens who are paying attention, it gives us the ability to hold folks accountable, and that means corporations, that means special interests, that means the millionaires and billionaires. We don't actually have all the information and all the facts right now, and so it makes being a watchdog more challenging. But I do think once we have the transparency, the next step is, what do we do with it? What reforms do we run with? Because we now have a much clearer picture of what's actually happening. Can we move the needle on some of the other bigger ticket things that feel very aspirational and hard that we've been talking about tonight?
I'm a little bit of a pariah in the campaign finance community in D.C. because I don't think the truth is going to set us free. I think we can know everything we can know about these candidates, but it's like we're going to dislike the money on both sides. I think about disclosure as a fine thing to have, but I don't think it gets us to where it doesn't alter power. It doesn't alter who has control. I think about it a little bit as that webcam at the bottom of the Deepwater Horizon years ago when we had the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. We saw all the blank spilling out into the Gulf, but it didn't do anything to stop it. It may have gotten us a little bit outraged, but it didn't actually speed any solutions. And so while I think it's important to know where the money's coming from, don't get me wrong, I'm not that much of a pariah. I don't think it's necessarily going to get us to where we need to go, in part because it's still a very, very small slice of the electorate and a very small number of very powerful interests that are funding everything on both sides, right? So it doesn't involve the rest of us. We can actually predict where a lot of the money comes from on one side or the other based on what we know of giving patterns anyway, regardless of whether we see the money or not. It's coming from, Wall Street on both sides. It's coming from oil companies and the Republicans. It's, it's just like you can go through the list and kind of figure it out. But it's important to know it's not going to get us, it's not going to build any additional power for any regular people.
Okay, question over there.
Yeah, you were mentioning that one of the the virtues of not having as much private money is the ability to engage more people. But I think there's another question, which it's not the amount of people that are involved, it's the nature of the discourse. If the discourse is based more upon reason rather than purely monetary or vested interests, whether it's more people or less people, I think this is the major point, and that in campaigns that are financed by large amounts of money and by vested interests, the nature of the discourse tends to be compromised, and you don't have reasoned discourse. And Aristotle said that law should be disinterested, based upon disinterested reason. So what happens is we pass legislation that's not rational, and it just meets the, vested interests, whether it's the public or whether it's a corporation. So what do you think about that?
I want to pick a fight with you. There's actually a fair amount of academic literature that looks at how much the debates have shifted to the extremes when you have contributions that are larger. And then there's some academics who say, oh my God, all these people, all the candidates who raise large number of small contributions are the ones that are also the ones on the extremes, right? My attitude is the more you incentivize more people engaged in the process, the more likely it is that you as a candidate are going to be beholden to a much larger group of people, and you're not going to you're just going to have to listen to more people, and that listening is part of our democratic process.
Could I jump in there, Rhoda? Because I just, one of the things I think is interesting about what you've been saying, David, is that if there's one thing that political scientists know, there's a lot we don't know, as you can tell from what happened with the last election, which nobody predicted in political science. But if there's one thing we do know, it's that political competition is really good for democracy. It's really good for democracy for obvious reasons, because you can throw the bums out, right? But it's also really good because it increases participation. So where there's real political competition, credible opponents, people are more engaged. And it also increases political knowledge. So the thing that's, I think, very interesting about this, grassroots level is that the more people are engaged, the more people run, the more competition. It's like it's a snowball effect. All these other things that we want to happen are more likely as well.
Thank you, Lisa.
On that, if I can answer your question, that's a good one. When I used to run, I always signed a fair campaign practice pledge that I would not demean the other person, and I would report income, and I'd do, in a way that would fulfill your requirement for greater clarity and discourse. So you've got to get people. That was started. That process was started by one of the Taft brothers in Cincinnati back in the 1960s, and didn't go very far because I guess it didn't have enough money to support it. But something like that, like organizations like you, could ask candidates to pledge a fair campaign practice, and that makes a difference, because if you sign that and you make that public and put it on the record, and your other candidate starts to, first of all, you challenge your other candidate, your opponent, to do the same. Of course, most of them won't. They just obviously they think that that's a ploy. But then you would get some sort of a arbiter, a independent arbiter to judge that, well, this person violated it, and it would make a difference.
Okay, more questions? Okay, right here in the middle. Okay.
So I wasn't planning to ask a question, but that begged a question for me, quite frankly. Why isn't that a standard that we should expect from anyone who wants to be nominated for a position, particularly in the federal government? The incivility we have right now and the lack of good practice in terms. If businesses have to practice in a good way, why not the people who lead our country? Why isn't there something? My background was always in staffing, and I thought, why don't we need to have an interview for the president? We have one who has no capacity. They're
then you can
running
say
the
you're fired.
biggest company probably in the world. I mean, our world, right?
Yeah.
And they have no qualifications. I mean, why isn't there some kind of vetting process to say,
Yeah.
are you even qualified? You know?
It's called an election.
Right.
No, it's not an election
know it
because
isn't.
the people
It's-
don't get the
and
real
it's
story
rigged,
about the
right?
person's qualifications. So
We do
so-
have this pesky thing called this First Amendment that, like, I think the civility pledges it would certainly, get past a coarsening of our politics. Our politics are incredibly coarse. And, but these are the kinds of things that have to be rewarded, right? Politicians need to feel rewarded if they do this. Although, right now, all the rewards is to run these really awful negative kind of, if you get a chance, take a look at some of the advertising running in Virginia if you go home. It is just awful. So, but there are rewards for that, and the reward is the public office you're seeking, right? So we have to change the rewards and the incentives to uncoarsen our politics. Maybe that is citizen groups asking for civility pledges. Maybe it's just voters deciding enough of this. I don't have the answer, but there is this, this First Amendment thing is a little bit of a problem. Yeah, there are some, but anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean that's been discussed. Well, I agree that the reward of winning an election when you do bad things means that people continue to do them, and that goes for the way they raise money and the way they talk and what they put on TV and online. But we have considered regulations. There are some things you cannot put on TV, some things you cannot put on the radio. But Public Citizen has in the past endorsed platforms of fair advertising to try to rein in some of the worst abuses of attack ads. But it is true that currently attack ads, as much as everyone says they hate them, we do, but they just still work. It's the repetitive nature of seeing something negative like that, it works.
Okay, I think over here.
The idea of a third party, I think trying to reform the two parties that we have would be a much better step. And in New Jersey, the election laws are such that ordinary citizens can very much affect their political parties. Every voting district is allowed to have a man and a woman represent them in the party county organization. I was involved with one of the parties many years ago in running for office, for county office, and at that time we had a party chair who insisted that the party not endorse a candidate prior to the primary. So every candidate who qualified would appear in the line. You get a lot more people involved coming out to vote. It certainly increases the importance of the party, and it's helpful to everybody. So for people who haven't been involved before, I would urge you, work through either whichever party appeals to you. Get on the ballot as a county committee, man or woman, and get in there and fight for what's right with the political parties we have. A third party would complicate things extremely because it would be far more difficult to get a majority to run anything. Is that a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So let me.
Well stated.
So I think there's so go to citizen.org to see Lisa's work. My organization's website's everyvoice.org. There's another website that's probably more important than either of ours, which is run by the Reflective Democracy Campaign by the Women's Donor Network. It's a national organization that has just done, I believe the website is Who Represents Us or whorepresents.us. No, that's a different organization.
no.
But there is that website too.
If you email me that,
I will.
then I will
yeah.
email it.
So, and the reason I'm suggesting it is they have done a catalog of every single elected official at the federal level, state level, and city level, and they're beginning to do work even deeper to assess who they are, like, and just have collected information about candidates. And as you can probably guess, fewer women are in office than the numbers in the population, fewer of other kind of historically marginalized groups. But one of the other parts of their research is on gatekeepers, on who actually gets even approached to run for office, and then what are the rules that allow some people to move forward in the process and not. And it's a really utilized part of the reform agenda. We don't often think about, we think about like who wants to go raise money and but we don't think about like, you mentioned the full-time legislature. How many lower or middle income people can afford to be in office and actually take off time from their jobs to campaign, right? For the 6 months or 9 months it would take. Most people can't do that. In most states, legislatures are paid a whole lot less than they ought to be paid. And so there are these other barriers that we don't talk a lot about because they're not as easy to kind of answer. But the gatekeeper question is an incredibly important one, and there are structural ways to change who actually moves forward in that process.
Good.
Were you trained by Polly Woodford? Polly Woodford?
Polly Woodford.
Were you trained by her?
Well, I know her.
But you sound like you got it right from her.
Okay.
And from my own personal experience.
That's very, very, very well said.
Okay. We have a question up here.
Nobody's mentioned the time that is spent in the campaign. I'd like to know if you feel, I don't think it would have a big impact, but I think it could have a minor one. Do you recommend shortening the amount of time? Are there any barriers to that, like free speech? What can the FCC do more of when it comes to providing free campaign ads during a short period of time? But just speak to the time.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people don't get involved because it's exhausting, takes too long to go through the process. And as we can see, in most countries, campaigns are much, much shorter and quite effective. They get more voters out.
Yeah, well, I'll speak to the federal, and I'm sure my colleagues will speak to the state, but it feels almost like perpetual campaign in D.C. I mean, we're talking about needing to accomplish the budget and whatever happens with taxes and every piece of legislative business, if we can, before December, before in January it becomes 2018, and then because the 2018 is said out loud, it's election time. And that is the reality. We have very tiny windows to actually get business done because campaigning takes up the majority of the time. And that's how legislators think about what they're going to do as well, because as soon as it's 2018, what are they going to say that they accomplished? Not very much, but that is the way that it's thought about. So it is certainly a problem. I think it's harder to figure out exactly how to rein it in because we can't tell people to stop talking about it. We can't necessarily say that it's too early to declare your campaign. There are strictures once you're a candidate, things that you can do and you can't do. But in terms of actually saying you're not allowed to start saying that you're going to run for office, that's a lot harder to figure out how to do.
I can almost guarantee you that if Congress tried to pass some kind of legislation that restricted when you can announce your campaign or how long you can talk about it, there would be immediate First Amendment challenges to that. I personally think that that's absurd, but I think you would have those challenges immediately and be very difficult. But I don't want to be pessimistic. I want to say I loved the senator's comment about nobody thought the colonists were going to be a country, so let's think big.
Yeah.
So one of the incentives in a public financing program, if you want to avail yourself of a small donor system, is that you have to abide by certain rules. And one of it could be you can't raise money in the non-election year, or you can't start your campaign until a certain date. That's something a candidate would voluntarily do to themselves rather than something that's forced on everyone.
Also in a publicly financed campaign, you can establish spending limits. And spending limits will cut down the length of time that that candidates will be out there doing their campaigning.
My question, is there legislation now that can be looked at and supported?
In Congress?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there are There are several bills in Congress. The ones that my organization works on, one is H.R. 20 in the House. It's the Government by the People Act. Representative John Sarbanes is a lead sponsor. He has about 160 co-sponsors in the House. And in the Senate, the bill is authored by Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. I don't have the Senate number on that bill on the top of my head, but it's the Fair Elections Now Act. It's the one that if you do get a chance to communicate with Senator Booker, to thank him for his co-sponsorship on that. Actually, Senator Menendez is also a co-sponsor of it, but I think he's a little busier these days.
And there are just a couple others to flag. So I think I've mentioned a number of the important bills that would rein in corruption and conflicts of interest. Also the Honest Ads Act, which would get more disclosure for online advertising. But the kind of meta bill that's out there is called the We the People Act. So it encompasses tons of the things that we've talked about today. Whether you support them all equally, they're all in there. Public financing, disclosure, lobby reform, things that would rein in ethics infractions. So it's kind of the catch-all for democracy reform. So that is the We the People Act.
You got a man up there that's had his hand up for a long time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks.
I just wanted to ask if I'm a little bit concerned that the money out of politics movement could become very much of a hydra-headed monster that's going in a bunch of different directions with a bunch of different organizations. And I want to commend Public Citizen because I see you across the boards. And you must be in some liaison capacity with all this mishmash that we have. I want to know, I'm sure Public Citizen will have a representative at the Unrig the System Summit in New Orleans in February, but I wonder, will anybody else on the panel be there so we can try to get some consistency and a single-pointed focus to the whole movement?
Yep. Yeah, no, we'll be there. I'll be there myself. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you.
Sure.
Any more questions? Am I missing anybody?
You got one there.
Okay.
You briefly hit on Trump benefiting from the presidency. What has happened with the Emoluments Act and that lawsuit that they were so vigorously talking about early on in D.C.? Do you know anything about that?
So they've had a set of arguments. They've appealed, and now we're waiting to see what happens next. So we don't have any resolution, but they're continuing to pay a lot of attention to it. I mean, the question is just standing questions. So whether people feel that they're actually, or the courts feel that they're actually being harmed. So we'll see how that question gets decided. But certainly, just from a layman's perspective of what's happening, there are clear violations of the Emoluments Clause. There are a couple of different suits that are pursuing it, so we hope that one of them is successful.
Last question? No? Well, thank you so much, and thank you. And take some time to take a look at the books that are out there and some of the literature that's out there. And we'll see you in January.
Dave?
Remarkably optimistic. You said that's not
Show your work.
You did. You did.